Tonight's presentation is on her Cold War, women in the U.S. military, 1945 to 1980. And I want to welcome Tanya Roth. Good evening to you and welcome to our book talk. We're glad you're with us.
Thanks for having me, John. I've been really excited to have this tonight.
Great. So Tanya and I have talked a little bit about this, but I'm interested in hearing much more about the book. Book came out, I believe, last year, right, Tanya, from
Yes.
UNC Press.
Yes.
Dr. Roth received her PhD in American history, I believe,
Yes.
and from Washington University in St. Louis. And we're glad you are with us here to talk about women in the military in the Cold War period. So again, good evening, and we'll go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and just start out with a basic question, Tanya, which is, how did you come to focus on this particular area in American military history and eventually write about the book? How did you get started in this project?
I love talking about this because in some ways I fell into it. I discovered women's history in undergraduate, and I started out with World War One. I thought that was really interesting, women in World War One. What happened next? I started graduate school, and I remember thinking, oh, there's a lot on World War II. It's such a rich topic, and it's such an important topic, but I wanted to know what happened next. I like sequels. I like what comes next. And as somebody growing up, I came of age during Desert Storm in the 90s and seeing the military change. I remember thinking, oh, wait, how did women get into the military? And it looked like there was just this gap. Nobody could tell me what happened after World War II. And I went looking very early in graduate school. I happened to fall into a book from the Women's Military Memorial in Arlington about women in the Korean War period. I went, oh, this is interesting, and discovered the Women's Armed Services Integration Act in 1948. And then I realized the military was offering women equal pay long before anybody else was. And I went, there's something here. I want to see what this is. And it just took off.
And I'm sure there was a lot of documents, archival information I know you were talking earlier to me about traveling around to various archives and online too, and trying to find things. So how would you, in a nutshell, how would you summarize what you found and what the thesis of your book is?
I think the big argument is that we need to think about the military as a site of how women's equality changes. The second wave feminist movement is very important, certainly, but the military offered women equal pay and benefits and job opportunities long before these were things being fought for in the wider world. There were some women in the factory sector and industrial work that were fighting for equal pay around the same time. But the military is not a place we often think of as being on the forefront of change. And they're not trying to do this necessarily, but it becomes a place where the question of what does it mean to be equal, especially for women, starts changing. And I think that the military is a site of looking at how equality for women changes, not just activist women who have very important stories in the feminist movement and other circles, but women who don't always think of themselves as activists. How are they engaging in their own lives and creating change and creating the vision of equality that they are looking for?
Well, you start right after World War II, and so one of the first important milestones in the beginning of the story for you is when you talk about the 1948 Women's Armed Services Integration Act. What was that, and what was the impact that had on this movement?
This was a really important piece of legislation that General Eisenhower began fighting for really as soon as the war ended. As the story kind of goes, when they started sending women to serve with him during World War II, at first he thought, no, women will not be helpful. What do we need women here for? They can't help with the war. But he essentially called himself a converted skeptic. He saw how well this worked. He saw the things that women did as well or better than men, which is how they put it. And he said, no, the military has a place for these women. Let's bring them on board. Now, he's probably the highest ranking person that gets this going. There's certainly Colonel Mary Halloran is another person who's thinking about this, and there are a few other individuals as well. So as World War II is winding down, and we think of the end of World War II as Japan signing the treaty in late 1945, this legislation doesn't come until June of 48, but they're starting the process much earlier. So in 46 and 47, there are early versions of this going through committees in Congress, but they're not going very far. Part of the reason it takes so long is they are drawing down the troops. Technically, President Truman technically extended the end of World War II to December 1947, just in terms of the date for how they needed to get people home, not the official end of the war. So Congress in that time changes. It gets a little harder. There's disagreements, and it just becomes this long, drawn out process. Eisenhower, by the time it goes through in 48, he's out of the military. He's up at Columbia University doing other things, but he comes back to fight for this legislation. But the mentality is, it's not about, oh, women did such a great job, let's give them something equality. It's more about, all right, we know we're going to have occupations in the Far East, in Europe. We know we need personnel. We have all these men who are drafted. We want to get them home to their families. Do we have to keep drafting men? Can we get rid of the draft? Can we use women as a volunteer force? And eventually Congress hems and haws, well, maybe we need women as reserve status. Maybe we can do permanent full status. We're not quite sure. And eventually in the spring of 1948, it becomes, all right, full status for women, reserve and full-time status. Let's do it. And Truman signs the law June 12th, 1948.
Let me ask you another question about after World War II period. You mentioned that there were restrictions on roles for women based on gender. So what were those restrictions, and how do you think women changed those, or how did they get changed?
That's a really important place to look, because the number one thing is no combat. I think that's really interesting, because today the question of what combat means, it's something in the last 20 years that we've talked a lot more about. But in 1948, they just said, oh, women won't fight. It's not until the 70s that they actually create a definition. What does it mean to be in combat or combat support roles? They're just thinking women don't hold guns. They don't fire guns. They don't do anything that involves weapons. They are thinking about administrative things, human resources, desk support, the sort of backup things that in a bureaucratic army, military, and all the forces that you need. So they initially come up with a few criteria. They want to make sure that it's a job that is socially appropriate for women, because they don't want women going out, and they know that women can drive trucks. They know women can be mechanics. But as one commander says, we don't really want to just put women out there repairing trucks because they can. Americans might have a field day with that in the late 40s and early 50s. What are the things that are socially appropriate for them to do, and where do we need them? They also want to make sure that women, there's a few other factors, such as, are all the steps on the career path, the promotional ladder, are they open to women? So if it's going to be something that eventually promotes to an area women can't go, because there were rank restrictions for women until the early 70s, or late 60s, I apologize. And also they want to make sure they're not sending, say, one woman to a faraway remote location where it's one woman and 100 men. They want to make sure that there are other women in that place. It doesn't have to be balanced gender-wise. They will allow women to move into male-dominated fields. Frankly, every field in the military is going to be male-dominated when women are a minority, but they want to make sure that it's not going to be one woman all on her lonesome.
Mm-hmm. Now, were there restrictions on nurses, female nurses being in the Army? That was considered to be a traditional role, right? And therefore, there didn't seem to be many objections about that. How far did that go back?
That's a great question. The Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps get created in the early 20th century, and I'm not sure how their regulations changed broadly. But by the time they get through World War II, it's certainly well established that nursing is a feminine role. There's a few more allowances for women. The harder thing is the flip side, allowing men into the nursing corps because it's not seemed as appropriate for men. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act didn't handle the nurses. They got handled through a separate act in 1947, I believe, that passed pretty quickly because the military needed nurses. So their restrictions are going to be more in terms of they're not going to be the same criteria necessarily. They just need to be where they're needed at the times that they're needed.
Gotcha. All right. How did the military branches go about recruiting women, especially in the 1950s and 60s, and in that period, really kind of before the women's movement took off? And there was, you mentioned, and you have some great illustrations in the book of how I think the Army in particular advertised in magazines and newspapers about how, you know, some of the best looking women are in uniform or something along those lines. I can't remember the tagline, but how did once they decided, okay, women can be in the military and more active, how did they decide to go, how did they recruit women?
This is one of my favorite parts, so I'm going to probably go on for a little bit. You'll have to bear with me.
That's okay.
It's really fascinating because women are volunteer only, and certainly there's always been volunteer opportunities for men, but especially coming out of a war where there's a draft, and then the draft resumes pretty soon after, and then we know that Vietnam is coming not long, Korea and then Vietnam. There's going to be more drafting of men, but women are always going to be a volunteer force, and that means they're trying to create this image that's very feminine, very ladylike, because they believe this is the image Americans want. During World War II, there'd been some concerns about whether the women in the military were too mannish, maybe too lesbians. They're worried about the perception because they've had this problem coming out of World War II. So they're thinking, let's see, we need to have these women be always looking very refined. Their uniforms will be perfect. They're using big scale designers to create the uniforms. They're doing everything they can to really make this look like her perfect image. And so I start with talking about the Miss America pageant, which is 1951, 1952. They decide that it's a great idea if Miss America at that time, it embodies the best of American womanhood. During World War II, Miss America contestants had been volunteering for war causes. They epitomized the American woman. So they thought, let's make this association. They send a group of women doing recruiting work there. They're passing out brochures. They're talking about military service. I'm not quite sure who the audience of the Miss America pageant was. I mean, maybe they're hitting up the parents, because if you're a young woman under 21, your parents have to sign off. So that could be very beneficial. Maybe young women were going to see the pageant. But my favorite part is when they decide, Marilyn Monroe, up and coming starlet. And Marilyn Monroe to this day always has that allure and just epitomizes this great image in the 50s, but maybe a very sexualized image today we often think about. So they snap a photograph. You can find this image online. I'm afraid I couldn't put it in the book because it's very expensive, but you can find it online. They snapped this great picture of her, and I opened up a scrapbook in the National Archives and discovered this picture. And I remember thinking, what is Marilyn Monroe doing in a scrapbook with 4 women from the military? It was one from each of the service branches. And the articles that came with this were all about how right after this photo came out, some Army officials like, kill the photo, kill the photo. And if you look at the photo today, to our eyes, there's nothing bad about it. Marilyn Monroe's dress is cut a little lower than the service women whose collars come up to here. But that's the concern. They thought it might send the wrong image. And when I was researching the book itself, I came across an interview that Monroe did with the Saturday Evening Post a few years later. And she's like, I don't know what happened. I don't understand why they were all concerned. But it's this moment where they are really scared about what this is going to do for their national image. I haven't found that there was any impact on them negatively, but certainly recruiters were very aware of this, and Army officials were paying attention. So that gets us started. Some of the best ads I found came out of that campaign. They're kind of hard to find, but they're Share Service for Freedom. They were trying to emphasize women and men working together in the military. There's some great images of servicewomen and the Statue of Liberty, and really playing up the patriotic element of this. And then as you go a little further on, you get these ads for parents. Hey, parents, you'll be so proud of your daughters. Long recruiting brochures that explain to parents very clearly the educational benefits, the emotional benefits, all the things that are going to help their daughters become better American women. Another one of my favorites is the early 60s, Somebody Special. And this is a full color, many, many pages, and it follows this young woman who's thinking about joining the military. And along the way, not only is it telling her the typical things the recruiting materials have, such as here's the education you can get, the jobs you might do, travel, you can travel and see the world, and maybe you'll meet somebody. But my favorite is the spread in the middle where she's in this really gorgeous uniform, her dress uniform. They got this red rose crossing 2 pages, and it's got a caption about how it's basically the most beautiful thing in the world. But that's going to be attractive to young American women, particularly attractive for they're really playing to young white heterosexual women. They are not just recruiting white heterosexual women. They do just want heterosexual women, but they're also recruiting women of all races, because desegregation has meant that all of the women's services are allowing anyone in at this time, but the recruiting materials do focus on white women for the most part. Into the early 70s, there's a wonderful ad I include that talks about how being in the military is not going to cause you problems for marriage either. So it's very stereotypical. I think if you think of what many Americans might think of the post-war period with June Cleaver, Leave It to Beaver, houses and picket fences, they're really thinking about the daughters who might live in those homes, who are maybe dad served in World War II, and they're thinking about what they can do after high school. Maybe they can't afford college, they're not ready to get married. They can go have a career for a few years and see the world.
So when the women were recruited and inducted, was their training, their basic training, separate, and was it different than what men went through?
It was separate from the men. There's a brief stint into the 50s where there is a limited amount of weapons training that happens. It doesn't last for very long. They get rid of it very early on, but they're keeping it separate from men. They're going through the same sorts of basic military things you might get, military traditions. What does it mean to be in the military? You're marching, you're doing all those things you see in videos, or if you've been in the military, you've experienced, but they're not doing the same maybe physical work that men are doing. They are doing bivouacs in the early 50s. There's some really great articles that come out about wax on bivouac, but that doesn't last long either. It really ends up shifting towards, all right, let's train you on how to do your hair, how to do your makeup, how to wear your uniform correctly. They have some really great materials that are made for the military about how do you, like, there's what's the best way to brush based on your face style, how do you hold your hair back, and how do you do your makeup, and teaching them things that will help them be the personal hygiene and grooming that will go along with everything else.
So can you give us an overview of the various organizations and structures of units that women belong to in the, we've talked about the Army Nurse Corps. What about the Army Women's Corps, the Waves, ANC, anything along those? What were some of the ones that were the main kind of organizations within the military?
Yes, that's a great question. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act focuses specifically on 4. They're not the only ones, but it's the Women's Army Corps for the Army. The Air Force had also just been created in 1947. So the Air Force has, it's not a formal corps like the Women's Army Corps is. The Women's Army Corps is the most robust and defined as its own separate unit in the Army. But the women in the Air Force, or the WAFs, they will go train in Texas, and it's just similar things. The women in the Navy are not formally called the Waves anymore after World War II, but the name
Okay.
sticks because that's what everybody knew them as. So they're still Waves is probably the best way to refer to them in general. And I apologize if you're a woman who was in Waves at that time and they called you something else. I'd love to know. It just that's the more informal thing that sticks in most of the literature I've seen. The Marine Corps, it's the women Marines, the Army Nurse Corps, the Navy Nurse Corps. The Coast Guard was not included in the legislation because it's only military during time of war, but during World War II, there'd been the SPARs for the Women Coast Guard. So I'm not sure how the Coast Guard gets handled after that, but those four, the WAF, the WAC, the Waves, and the Women Marines are the big ones that I look at in my book because they all fall under that act. And then within each one, of course, you're going to have other divisions. Like there'll be medical groups and medical specialists and other divisions and things like that that go down. But broadly speaking, you can break it into those four groups.
Mhm. So as we go along in time from the 40s and 50s into the 60s, what was the American public's reaction to more women serving in the military, and did that view change over time?
Well, I like that question. The short answer might be that most American people aren't aware of women in the military because their numbers are so small. Yes, nurses they're going to be aware of, especially as Vietnam heats up and there are more women who are becoming nurses. But their eyes, I think, are really on the men in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And again, the women in the medical fields. So the numbers are set by law at 2%, that according to the 1948 Act, in the 50s and 60s, only 2% of the entire military strength can be women. And they never reach that. So that's, it stays small. I think they come closest in the early 50s, but they're really looking at maybe 1% of the overall force. And I think it's just, they're not visible. If you happen to have a family member, a lot of women join because they have family members in the military or they know somebody. But if you're not connected in that way, I think there were whole parts of the nation that just didn't know. But the big thing that happens to help Americans know about women's service opportunities and to really publicize women's service in a positive way is the creation of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. I don't know if today, whether I've got the pronunciation right, but I've always called it DACOWITS. It still exists today. And this organization is women who are civilians from across the nation. They're very highly regarded civilian women. Some of them are doctors and teachers and professionals. Ann Landers is one of them. Sandra Day O'Connor joins in the late 70s for a little bit. So women who are very high level, some who are also very involved in the philanthropic areas of their communities as well. Maybe their husbands are high-ranking military officials, and they're going on trips to bases, learning what service women want and need, and then they go back to their communities and they do things like, let's have a luncheon and we'll talk about women's military service, and we'll interview some women to talk about their experiences. So doing these small things locally to try to get women knowing that, hey, this is a career opportunity that you can do. I think really in the 50s, it's kind of in the background, but in the 60s, it keeps creeping up. And President Lyndon Johnson kind of helps with this because by the time he comes to office, women in the military are facing a problem. There may not be a ton of them, but there are women who've been serving since World War II, and they're hitting up on the promotional limits that have been put in place. And Lyndon Johnson helps with the movement that's already been underway to try to remove those rank limitations, because he has a woman in his office, one of his assistants, who is in the military. I think she's in the reserves by the time she gets to him, and he wants her promoted to colonel, and that can't happen. So there are enough women moving into places where people notice them, but then they can start to make other changes as well.
Sure. Let me ask you another question about the different branches. Did the four branches, and maybe Coast Guard too, if you have information on that, did they differ regarding women in the service in terms of opportunities and the overall climate inside their branches? about women, and you mentioned advancement and pay and rank. Were the branches different?
They keep everything about pay and rank is kept uniform across the services. I think for just basic, this makes sense for us to not have differences. So that because it's all under the Department of Defense, that helps. This with the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947, that makes it a lot easier to just say we all fall under Defense Department, so we're all going to have the same, thing. The difference comes in because the titles of the ranks. So, for example, in the Army um, and the Air Force and so on, the highest rank they can get to is colonel, but that rank is not the same in the Navy. So the wording is a little different, but the rank is approximately the same. They're all doing very similar things about where women can and can't serve. There may be some local discrepancies that happen, but in general, they're kind of in a similar place. They're not doing anything too out of line with each other. The numbers are going to be varied. There is an argument to be made that perhaps the Air Force was maybe a little bit more ahead of the game when it came to women. In some ways, they were the newest of the forces. There's some women who are very forward thinking, like General Jeannie Home. So there may have been some more opportunities there. There was a perception among some women I spoke to that the Air Force was the best one to go to. But then again, there's also the perception that the Army is the best one to go to. So it really just depends on which one you like the best, I think. So they're doing a lot of similar things. But I think that, my gosh, I had it in my head and it left. Oh, I think the place where you see perhaps the biggest discrepancies across the board is policies such as pregnancy, because officially, if you are pregnant, you cannot be in the military. If you are found to be pregnant, you should be out right away. Well, in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, pregnancy tests are far different from what you do today. So it might take longer for a woman to know she's pregnant. She may not have had a test. There's any number of factors. So even though officially, once a woman finds out she's pregnant, she's supposed to be out until the early 70s, really. Some commanders will tell the women, no, just stay, you're fine for a little while longer, keep working, and then you'll leave. As an informal culture, just depending locally about who your commanding officer happens to be, where you happen to work, etc. So there are some stories of women who have to leave as soon as they find out they're pregnant, and others who get to stay in almost to the day they give birth because they happen to have someone who facilitates that.
Mhm. And you have an entire chapter on motherhood and being in the military, where you go into a lot of detail on that. And, what about women being married? When they were recruited, you mentioned that a lot of the recruiting information said, oh, you don't have to, give up a spouse in the future, a husband in the future. What were the rules and regulations on marriage once you were recruited into the military?
Initially, what they're saying is if you were someone who served in World War II and you're already married, because the women who served in World War II were often a little older, already married. Like General Mildred Bailey was married. Her husband was her fiance in World War II, and then they married. So if you had that background of service, they're going to let you continue as long as you don't have a kid. But really, it's supposed to be you have to be unmarried. You can marry while in service, and you can stay in service as long as you don't get pregnant and have children. But they're imagining that these women will probably not be there for very long if they do get married. So unmarried, you can marry. There's an interesting discrepancy that I found because according to the regulations, you could stay in service and be married, not a problem. But there's times, especially in the 50s, where they expanded. So they give this opportunity for a marriage discharge. Oh, you got married? You want to leave the service? We'll let you leave the service. But it gets a little harder in times like the Korean War when, oh, you want to leave the service? We can't let you do that right now. So they restrict the opportunities. What I found really interesting in speaking to women veterans is that there was a perception, many women told me, oh, if you got married, you had to leave. So officially, you didn't have to, but so many women did take that opportunity and leave. Perhaps they just became pregnant quickly after getting married, or perhaps they happened to luck out at one of those times it was easier, or maybe their term of service was already close to finishing, but there was a perception among the women I spoke to that you couldn't serve if you were married. on paper you could, but the practices were very different.
My next question is kind of an overall question, which is, was Congress supportive of the changes in women's military service, or reluctant to go along? And I guess maybe I should say, was Congress kind of pulling, being pulled into this, or were they the ones who were pushing for this?
I think there's a little bit of both going on. In 1947, 1948, one of the things I think is interesting about that Congress is that it is the first time since Franklin Roosevelt's first term in the early 40s, since there's been a president who's a Democrat and a Congress that's majority Republican. So for most of FDR's years in office, from 40 to 45, it was a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. So there's a nickname for the 80th Congress, I apologize, of the Do Nothing Congress. And I think I just misspoke. It may be the 82nd. I'm sorry. We're going to go with late in the day. I apologize. I know which Congress it is.
Okay.
But the Do Nothing Congress, because they've got a different agenda than the president. And look, there's been a Democrat in office for 16 years. So and the war just ended. So there does seem to be a big push from the House in particular that they don't need women to have full military status, that reserve status would be absolutely fine. If you're doing this, if you're letting women into the military because you need them, then you only need them as reserves, and you bring them in on active duty when you need them. But there becomes there's something that switches towards the end. There's a female congresswoman who says, hey, either you need these women or you don't. You can't go back and forth. Eventually somebody gets convinced and they pass it. So I think it becomes, because of the restrictions, like they're pretty much reassured that no, we're not going to send mothers into battle. We're not going to give women guns. We're not going to do these things. We're doing equal pay, and we're doing equal benefits, and we're doing these rank restrictions so that we can really contain women the ways that we need them. And okay, that works. And they don't really put up a fuss at all. There's not really any big efforts to try to lower women's service or do anything to it, not by Congress. There might be different elements in the Department of Defense at times, or different leaders in other places, but excuse me. Really, it's not until the 70s that I think we see the pushback. That's where I think we see Congress really doing some interesting things, because in the 70s, as the Equal Rights Amendment goes through Congress, it seems like there's this push for, okay, Equal Rights Amendment is happening. What does this mean for our military? And I don't know how reluctantly it is, but it does seem that a lot of the things that Congress says about changes to women's service status in the 70s, particularly admitting women to the military academies, that one seems to be really highly motivated by, we got this amendment coming, and if we don't make this change, we're going to have to do it later on. So we might as well make the change now and be ready to go. So I think that one is very, I think, motivated by trying to be proactive, and maybe feeling like their feet are getting held to the flames a little bit in some cases.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to go into one other question, just because one of the folks in the Q&A have already asked this, so and you've already covered it. So you mentioned the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. Just to clarify that, who, I guess the way to say this was, that committee that you state that is still around, who do they report to, and do they still have an impact today?
So this is the brainchild of Assistant Secretary of Defense Anna Rosenberg, the first woman in that position in the early 50s. And it's kind of building off of some similar things in World War II. And it looks like they're reporting to the Department of Defense broadly. Here, we're going to send you our stuff. I have to admit, I'm not sure exactly who they're sending their materials to in the 50s and the 60s. There's certainly, there's a liaison in the Department of Defense, absolutely. There's other people. I'm not sure, though, how far the reports got. So their influence is really interesting, because they're on the front edge of saying, hey, can you tell us what does combat mean? And starting in the 60s, if you're going to say women can't be in combat, we're looking at the roles that women play and the ones that they would like to play. What does it mean when you say combat or combat support? They push for removing rank limitations long before it happens. They push for a number of things that they suggest that women should have. They don't really get listened to all the time. It's the small things that get listened to. But that persistence, I think, matters, that having somebody attuned to this is what your personnel need, pay attention to this. Last year, I believe it was early last year, there was Dakowitz was cut all of a sudden as part of a larger movement to remove and consolidate some committees in the Department of Defense. It looks like it's being reinstated. But today, if you go on their website, you can look through their reports in the recent years. They are really looking at important issues like women's maternity, new mothers in the military, and how do we provide support for them? What do they need? How do we address logistical issues? Not just for that, but it's certainly a major issue. I don't know how influential they are today. I think they should probably be very influential. I think that having a group that's dedicated to this, they're listening to servicewomen's voices or trying to. I don't know today how much they're going out and doing the same things they did before. It seems since the 80s that the makeup of the committee has changed a bit and focused a little differently, that they're no longer trying to go out and help recruit and publicize women's service, but instead take on a different role that's more, okay, what do women in the service need? And I think that has the potential to be very powerful. And I was really excited to see this fall when they said, no, it's coming back. So I'm hopeful that it can bring a voice that gets even stronger.
So you have a chapter called Second Class Soldiers. What does that mean?
So we often use the phrase second-class citizens to think of the idea that, in theory, we have equality in the United States, but in practice, certain Americans, whether because of race, most often race, but also gender, do not get access to all the benefits or opportunities that they should have. So by the 1970s, what seems to have happened for women in the military is that for about 2.5 decades, nearly 30 years by that point, I guess, military service has been a place that offers them equality. We're going to give you equal pay, benefits. These are really important. But in actuality, there are still limits to the roles they can play, the ranks they can achieve, things like that. Women are still fighting to say, no, I would like this path. This is the path I want to take. Why is my gender a barrier, especially by the 70s, thinking about combat, for example. So this idea that they technically have all the benefits and rights of service members, but because they're still, by that point, set aside, no, you don't do combat. There's this, you don't get that part. And that's not to say that you have to be in combat to get all the benefits in military service. I don't think that's true. It's simply that sense of setting aside as this is something only men do or only one part of the military does. It helps valorize it, it sets it apart, and it creates a different class of things. So that seems to be what's happened by that point. That's the big question: is are women really equal in the military, or what does it mean to be equal? And I think that what that definition of equality is something that we see changing through the Cold War. And I think it's changing even today, and it's far different than it would have been 60, 70 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Another question I had for you after reading the later part of the years that you cover is about Vietnam, the Vietnam years, the really kind of the crescendo of U.S. involvement, the high point, a number of troops in Vietnam, our involvement there in the late 60s and beginning of the 1970s, coincided with a massive increase in pressure in the women's movement. So how do those two phenomena relate? Did they go hand in glove? Were they both related to each other? And how did the Vietnam War, or how did the women's movement affect women involved in the military, given the huge commitment of overall troops in Vietnam?
That's it. I love that question because I think that that connection between servicewomen and the women's movement is really interesting. Um, Most women that I spoke with, and certainly I'm working in small sample sizes and looking at other oral histories. So there are many women in the military that I have not spoken to, right? But there's this general sense that women didn't join the military because they wanted to show off their feminism, right? They might have been feminists, but they also are more likely as well to be like, I'm not a feminist. But um, so there are small numbers of women going to Vietnam outside of the nursing corps. The nursing corps are probably the most women going there. But the Women's Army Corps, I think, sends the highest number of non-nursing women, even though it's still small in the big scheme of things. What they're finding in those practical experiences is that, wait a second, we're in the middle of a war, and some of the restrictions you're placing on me don't make sense. There's a really interesting moment I found. There was a group of WACs that sent some letters back from Long Binh saying, wait, you want us to dress in these uniforms because image of the American servicewoman, but we're working in dirty, hot circumstances. Why are we wearing this? Are we here to look good or are we here to do a job? So they're starting to question the practicality. What is my purpose here? Which may not look like feminism per se, but it is certainly women saying, let's think about what is, men don't have to do this. What does it mean to be a woman in this situation? So there's that on the one hand. Back home, I think that Vietnam does raise feminist awareness as the women's movement is growing, that, oh, there are women in the military. What does that mean? Certainly, there are very small numbers of women who are service women who die in the Vietnam War. I want to say 8 off the top of my head, but I might be off on my numbers. So that's not going to hit public consciousness in a huge way. But what I find interesting is Dakowitz, and then under Kennedy, the President's Commission for the Status of Women, sort of the really tail beginnings of what will become the feminist movement in the early 60s. They're looking at the status of women in America. And one of those things they look at is women in the military. Some of the women involved in that commission go on to be part of the National Organization for Women. The National Organization for Women starts developing in the 60s, and then it becomes an issue of kind of like how Dakowitz tried to tell people, hey, service women are here, you should think about these careers. The National Organization for Women starts seeing, oh, there are women in the military, they have issues they're addressing, how do we support them? And it becomes slowly over time, the national organization's awareness of service women grows and they start paying attention. They're kind of late bloomers, I think, but then you see articles coming in the late 60s, early 70s, where service women are being interviewed and they're saying, we're not women's livers, but, and the generals, the women who become the first generals in all the services are very clear that they make a distinction between what they call the women's liberation movement and what women are doing in the military. That they don't want people to see this as a temporary political thing. They are very serious about the fact that they think the military has offered women something important and valuable for a long time. And these people who are coming in just now asking for equality have totally missed the fact that they themselves have been leading this for ages.
Okay, I'm going to try to get some of our audience questions in here for you. Let's see. Well, this is a question on issue that's very prominent in Army circles. I'm sure all the military, but certainly Army. Can you offer a perspective on the issue of sexual assault and harassment in the military? Has it gotten worse as women's roles have expanded? What are your thoughts on that?
This is a topic I think is really interesting and important. And as I was bringing the book together, that was something really on the forefront of my mind because it's been in the news so much the last couple of years. As I researched materials in the 50s and the 60s, I didn't find information about sexual assault, which begs 2 questions. Did it not happen, which I find hard to believe, quite honestly, or did they just not talk about it? I think it's probably the latter. I think that our language around what sexual assault is and how we identify it and how we talk about it, I think in the last, even the last decade has changed and expanded. I think that we might never know what the history of sexual assault might have looked like in the services in the Cold War, because there was more of a culture of silence. You don't talk about it. It's just the women growing up in those times and earlier. I mean, my grandmother was coming of age at that time. She was married and had children, so she wasn't in the military. But thinking back to her, she's not a person who would have ever spoken openly of sexual assault. So I think our culture has changed. I think that would be a really fascinating project if someone were able to go back and look at this. And I know there's some work being done on sexual violence in World War II, for example. So I think that'd be a really interesting topic to give us that broader history. But it's a topic that I couldn't find, and given what I was trying to do, I didn't press too deeply, I have to admit. But one of the things I think is interesting today, now that we have this vocabulary and this awareness, and we think about what this means, I think it may tell us something about what equality in the military means today, right? Women can serve in combat. There are no roles officially closed to people by their gender. But what does it mean to have those roles open and yet still have a culture where any members of the service, whether you're gay, lesbian, woman, man, black, white, religion, to have any sort of discrimination, but especially sexual assault. Sexual assault is often about power and not actually sexual desire, for example. So I think it tells us something about women's actual status, that there is still enough people or individuals who do not see them as equal members of the military. I would love to see people explore that further and see what there is there. I think it's a really interesting question that I have to admit I'm just starting to think through and process. So if that helps there.
Thank you. Another question is, what did women vets most appreciate about their service overall, and what were their disappointments or shocks regarding their service that you've come across doing your research and interviews?
It's a good question. Mostly, I think that they definitely felt patriotism, that this was, whether they served for 2 or 3 years or much longer, that doing something for their country was a very big piece of it. But also that they got to they got to have interesting jobs, or maybe jobs that weren't necessarily all that interesting, but were in interesting places. They seem to recollect those periods really fondly. Like, yeah, this is something I did that was really cool and I learned a lot and I remember it fondly. I can't think off the top of my head of anything that really surprised me. I think honestly the thing that surprised me most was women telling me that, oh no, you couldn't serve if you were married. And that's a point where when you're doing oral history, you don't say, you're wrong, let me show you this regulation. It was more of, I want to know more about this, because that was an interesting thing to think through and puzzle. But hearing there are so many women who served in so many interesting parts of the world, and the things that they got to do are just, it's amazing. And there's some really great oral histories that you can find online with the Veterans History Project, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and just diving in and seeing what women's experiences were is really fascinating.
Good, thank you. One of our audience members says that she loves watching documentaries, movies, and TV shows on military history or based on the military. Women are largely left out of the conversation. Why do you think that is? And do you think the representations that do exist of women in the military are accurate?
I love thinking about this. I found a really interesting book. It's very academic, but it's not very big. There are a couple authors who basically cataloged every movie that has to do with service women from World War II through, I want to say the 70s, maybe a little earlier. But I can think of a few movies that come to mind that we don't often think about, like what G.I. Jane in the 1990s with Demi Moore, the one with Goldie Hawn, and Private Benjamin. That's it, in the early 80s. There's, yeah, they're very strange, the ways we get depictions of women in the military today. And when I think of Private Benjamin, for example, it's a farce. It's meant to, we're meant to laugh at Goldie Hawn. And with even Demi Moore and G.I. Jane, it's meant to be like, wow, there's this woman doing things no woman can do, which I think looks a little different 25 years later. There's some interesting stuff right after World War II. Never Wave at a Whack, or but that one's also kind of like Goldie Hawn's meant to be kind of funny. But Skirts Ahoy. The Navy really liked that one in the early 50s and thought it represented Navy life well for women. But we don't often get that. We don't get a lot of, hey, here's what it means to be a woman in the military. And I think that especially today, as we think about streaming and films, and we consume so much media today, it's been a long time since MASH, right? And Margaret Houlihan, am I getting her last name right? Like that was our big depiction for so long, the nurses in the Korean War, but also on the one hand maybe very sexualized, but on the other hand not. But then again, there are women and there are men who are also sexualized. It'd be interesting to see if we could get some better representations of women, particularly in the Cold War period, and just bring that awareness out. I think we know World War II, we know the more recent. Can we get some continuity to understand that women didn't just serve in World War II and go away for 35 years and come back in the 80s and 90s. What did this really look like?
Mm-hmm. Another question, when did the service academy start admitting women and how did that happen?
1976. The first class of women cadets graduates in 1980. And the information on this is so interesting because this is one of the things that goes along with the Equal Rights Amendment, that some of the analysis is, if we get the Equal Rights Amendment, how will this change different segments of the government, the Department of Defense, and the troops? So legislation starts coming through Congress going, should we integrate the military academies? There's big pushback. I don't think any of the services really wanted to do it. I may be misremembering something, but West Point was not interested, for example, because they're thinking the military academies are for combat leadership. And yes, women were starting to advance to the role of general, admiral, but there's still only a few of them. They're not imagining there would ever be a place for women to be in combat. So if you think about the types of physical activities that cadets go through at the different academies, that's not really what they're envisioning for women. It's very advanced thinking. But there's a great piece in one of the testimonies where a representative from Minnesota, I think, says, you know what? I had 4 applicants to the Air Force Academy last year, and only one of them knew how to fly a plane. It was a woman, and I couldn't send her. Nobody else can fly a plane. Why am I turning away somebody who has a pilot's license for the Air Force Academy? So it kind of becomes, well, we got to do this, or we're going to be forced to do it. And it happens. Lots of surveys of cadets beforehand and during and after. But yeah, that's it. It's a huge change in 76.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like you have some fans already, Tanya, because we got a few questions along the lines of, what is your next book and when are we going to see it?
Hopefully a lot faster than this came out. I have to admit, this was about a 5-year process. I took about 5 years off after doing my dissertation research and PhD, and then about 5 years off and on working on this. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. It will absolutely be something focused on women's history because that's something that's very important to me. But my goal this year is, I've got a few thoughts I'm thinking about. My next step is to do some secondary source reading, and I'm really hoping by this summer to make a decision. So I don't try to do 5 things at once, but I'm very excited to do something next.
Well, we will have you back again, of course.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Tanya Roth and her book. I'll hold it up for those folks who didn't see it, the title page and the cover at the beginning of the program. We thank you very much for being here. Again, Tanya, thank you so much for being with us. I want to thank also our audience members who came out tonight and asked some great questions, and to our producer, Kenna, as well. Join us for more programs. And thank you all very much for being with us, and have a great night. Thanks again, Tanya.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Great. Have a good evening.